But now that we have rebuilt Job 40:24 towards its former glory, what do we make of the other two verses which bundle up with Job 40:24 into the concept of Behemoth / Leviathan being uncapturable and untamable? Are the other two correct, given what we have learned with regard to Job 40:24? As it stands in the KJV, we can surely be forgiven for querying the text. The first stick bears well, but the second stick seems somewhat adrift. Besides the lack of correspondence between the sticks towards that of poetic speech, drawing Leviathan out by his tongue is rather odd, to say the least. Furthermore, the verb for lowering the chord seems to be over-explaining the idea. Be that as it may, Job 41:1. Canst thou draw out Leviathan with an hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? We understand Leviathan to be a creature of the sea, and if we inspect the Hebrew word for hook, kaka, we can confirm that it is indeed an angling hook, a hook for fishing with. And so this aligns well with the whole concept. And this is supported by the Septuagint, where the Greek word agkistron translates to fish hook. Job 40:20, but wilt thou catch the serpent with a fish hook? Accordingly, within the same stick, we notice that the verb to draw out suits well the idea of hauling out a sea creature with a fishing hook. That said, this Hebrew word, masak, is not exclusive to drawing in a particular direction, but can mean to draw down or even draw along. On turning to the Septuagint, however, we see that it has ago, which Brenton translated to catch, and indeed masak of the Hebrew can mean to take hold, but more definitively the Septuagint's ago means to lead or to bring. Job 40:20, but wilt thou catch, lead the serpent with a hook. And to lead is the same as to draw along. Now, it may appear trivial at this point as to whether draw out or draw along be the right choice. Landing a fish, of course, would suit better the idea of drawing out, such as it stands in the KJV. Nevertheless, as we turn to a verse in the Psalms, let's notice how masak behaves in here and why. Psalm 10:9, he lieth in wait secretly as a lion, he doth catch the poor when he draweth him into his net. Here we pay close attention to this concept from the psalmist, that of drawing a creature into a net. He draweth him into his net. For what if the idea of Leviathan being drawn along by a hook is missing a net for him to be put into? For this concept is commonly done among fishermen, so as to keep the catch alive, for the net remains in the water at all times. Well, if we turn to the Peshitta, which has the language of Aramaic, we find perfectly situated in the first stick the Hebrew and Aramaic word, which we have met already, matsud. And this word translates to net. Job 41:1, will you hold the dragon in a net by a cord? Accordingly, and with all propriety, we can incorporate, nay, reincorporate net into our first stick in order to complete the concept, noting also that in a net and into a net are equally permissible in translation. Job 41:1, canst thou draw Leviathan into a net with an hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? So, that's the not too difficult part done. And now to the second stick. We remind ourselves here that there has to be some correspondence between sticks in order to conform to the metricity and style of poetry. I am not a poet, but even I can see that the verse needs some addressing to that extent. The first word of the second stick in the Masoretic is cord. Now, we can obviously see that the KJV has put tongue first in order, but actually the Codex has tongue at the end. Words can, of course, be shuffled in translation to meet the desired parlance. Nevertheless, the Hebrew word translated to cord is kebel, which means rope, and even a rope having a noose. And this word is not out of keeping. Indeed, it is within the broader context. And you may have noticed that the pesita verily has cord, which appears to be situated in the first stick, but if the conjunctive or were placed after net, then cord would belong to the second stick, as per the style in the Masoretic. Therefore, this does support that its presence is rightful, and so now our render is confirmed as thus. Job 41:1, canst thou draw Leviathan into a net with an hook, or with a cord which thou lettest down his tongue? So now, in terms of stick correspondence, cord matches hook, insomuch as both being restrainers of the animal. And now we can move on to the seemingly tautological lettest down, or lower. There is no support from either the Septuagint or the Peshitta, and therefore the Masoretic will do its best to reveal to us a solution. The Hebrew word for lower is sakah, which means to sink down. And with this more definitive meaning, it is even less likely to be standing correctly. Therefore, if we swap the initial consonant s for its unaspirated counterpart, s, and also swap the k for the similar sounding k, which evidently informs us that the story of Job was passed on orally in its beginnings, and then add the consonant b, supposing that the yod be the remnant of it, and then lose the ayin for now, we then get an undeniable admittance into our text, for the word is sakab, which means to drag, or even to draw along. And we understand already that drag has its counterpart in the first stick, draw. The resultant render, therefore, now stands accordingly. Job 41:1, canst thou draw Leviathan into a net with an hook, or with a cord thou draggest his tongue? Here it has been possible to drop the relative pronoun which, because it is not in the original text. And the sense remaining is, of course, that of having lassoed, for example, a crocodile. Dragging him is the only way that he is going to go with the lassoer. And to support the use of drag further, we have a scriptural example found in the second book of Samuel, which employs both kebel, meaning cord or rope, and sakah, meaning to drag or to draw, where the idea of dragging a whole city is done with the ropes. 2 Samuel 17:13, then shall all Israel bring ropes to that city, and we will draw it into the river. And now we can scrutinise the oddity of his tongue. The Masoretic uses the word lason for tongue, which, if the L were to lose its crest, thus resembling the letter R, and the S were traded for its unaspirated counterpart S, then we would be left with resen. And this Hebrew word means halter, even a halter that goes over the nose. And if we turn our attention to the Septuagint, then we will find just how accurate the word which we have discovered is. Job 40:20, but wilt thou catch the serpent with a hook, and put a halter about his nose? And being that this halter goes over the nose, and therefore around the jaws, the word put in the Greek, peritidemai, meaning just that. It is also known as a bridle. Therefore, we can confidently drop tongue from our verse and replace it with either halter or bridle. Job 41:1, canst thou draw Leviathan into a net with an hook, or with a cord canst thou drag his halter? And it is not a problem to dispense with the possessive pronoun his, currently expressed in the KJV by the vav on the end of lason, its suffix, because although the KJV has lason for tongue, the word may include a vav, thus giving the word a w sound. Therefore lason becomes lason. And let me tell you that the vav is quite a character, for he does pop up and drop out of words. And while bearing this in mind, whenever an N is the final letter of a word, it then changes form to look like a more imposing vav. Therefore, our erroneous text, by the slip of a stroke or two, may simply have the vav and the nun unwittingly transposed. By switching them back intentionally, we lose the pronoun and have lason instead of lasono. Therefore, to backtrack, we go from lasono, meaning his tongue, to lason, meaning tongue, to lason, also meaning tongue, and eventually to resen, meaning halter. Job 41:1, canst thou draw Leviathan into a net with an hook, or with a cord canst thou drag a halter? At this point, we reach the really exciting part of the verse reconstruction. For as far as stick correspondence goes, draw has its counterpart drag. Net now has its counterpart halter, and hook, and by implication the line, is paired with the noosed cord. But Leviathan has no counterpart. For the sake of stick correspondence, Leviathan is indeed unmatched. And as we turn to the book of Isaiah, we are perhaps familiar with Leviathan also being called dragon and serpent. Isaiah 27:1, in that day the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. And if we now turn to the Peshitta, we can notice there that dragon is indeed present, but Leviathan is not. And why therefore is dragon in the first stick? Well, let us notice that the beginning of each stick begins with the exact same word, hold, which loosely answers to our draw or drag. Typically, from what we have seen, exact repetition is not so conducive towards poetry, though there are exceptions. And neither do we try for this in everyday speech. Language is considered more elevated whenever repetition is avoided. Therefore, something has certainly gone awry here. Dragon could just as suitably belong or have belonged to the second stick also, i.e. with the second hold, because Leviathan is indeed translated to dragon occasionally. And as we insert, nay reinsert dragon into our text, we behold the render thusly. Job 41:1, canst thou draw Leviathan into a net with an hook, or with a cord canst thou drag the dragon a halter? Patently, we are not quite there yet. We are missing the preposition to, i.e. to the halter. Well, after all that we have done with the Masoretic, there is still a character standing on its own, the ayin, which got lopped off the end of the erroneous term letters down, and this while on returning the corrected term to drag. Now, I don't believe that this ayin was in the original text, but was put there when halter finally got misrepresented as tongue. If we reconsider the first letter of the erroneous lason, L, which we changed to the consonant R, and then merge it with the ayin in their order, we then discover a prefix which means on, i.e. on his tongue. This when added to the erroneous text in the Masoretic. Therefore, on the journey that this text has been on, we are presupposing that the text at one time had two consonants where there is now only a confounded one. And if we now lose the ayin and then slide the L to be halter's prefix, the result is our desirable preposition to. Job 41:1, canst thou draw Leviathan into a net with an hook, or with a cord canst thou drag the dragon to the halter? Therefore, by adding the prefix, we have successfully rebuilt the verse entirely. And on a final note, we do notice also that this immense creature has returned to the land in the second stick. Only now this behemoth of the land has metamorphosized into a more fearsome dragon.